possible clinical solutions. So are aligners really fantastic? Now we will assess this in a three-pronged strategy. We will first look at how aligners tend to move teeth. What are different clinical scenarios where we encounter problems? And what specifically are the problem areas that you encounter clinically? So as we get started, it's important to understand that why is tooth movement with aligners a challenge? Because there are no specific tooth points. In terms of tooth anatomy, it's variable for every single tooth. Aligner materials have properties that are very different across the spectrum. There is often a geometry mismatch and slipping motions that you tend to see. Now, there was an excellent paper published in the JWFO which speaks about Aristotle's first principle. Now, the first principle is a term that's often used in business studies, where you break down a complex problem into simple problems so that you cannot deduce any other proposition from it. So if you just basically break it down, when you were to ask this question to, let's say, a first year BDS student as to how do aligners move teeth, effectively there are two modalities: shape molding of the aligner itself and auxiliary elements that you add. Now there could be adjuncts, there could be auxiliaries that you add to teeth, could be all of them. So molding is essentially what happens to the aligner, and every auxiliary element happens to be like an anchor unit. Now what amongst these two is the primary determinant of tooth movement? Effectively, it's been proven time and again that in terms of just the surface area, you've got a larger surface area that basically engulfs the tooth, and that is the aligner itself. So essentially it is shape molding that primarily executes treatment. Now, having this premise, let's look at what does clinical data tell us when we look at different malocclusions. So if shape molding was working very well, if the addition of auxiliary elements of different modifications given by corporations are working very well, does it translate into clinical success the way we would want it? In terms of deep bites, today clinical literature tells you that effectively the mean efficacy that you get is around 33%. Now, we had a lecture just before this break where we were talking about percentages that were, or questions being posed from the podium where percentage questions were 60%, 70%, 80%, 90%. Alright, there we're still talking sense. But when you're going to talk about 30 and 40%, this is a clinical concern. And then you have modifications to systems where you try and modify the way you place attachments in the hope that the percentages will get better, not really too much. Now this was as far as deep bites are concerned. Let's now have a look at open bites. So in terms of open bites, literature tells you that primarily when you close an open bite with aligners, irrespective of what a lot of podiums tell you, essentially 60% of it is drawbridge, 30% is auto rotation if we are lucky, and only 10% is pure anterior extrusion. Again, the kind of attachment that you've used effectively in high peer-reviewed literature has not really been effective. So now you're wondering that this guy is telling us vertical malocclusions, we have a problem. Open bites, success rates are not very high. Deep bites, success rates are not very high. But then aligners are supposed to align, right? So at least they must be doing a good job of that. And we again have a phenomena like this that happens. Effectively, you are not directing forces through the center of resistance. So tipping, which is uncontrolled, happens to be your default tooth movement. And do we see that in clinical data? Well, this was a paper from a group in Australia and New Zealand, and you see even the simplest tooth movement, which is lower incisor tip, you have a mean efficacy percentage of around 35%. Well, probably they do a little better at torque if they don't do as it should in terms of tip Let's have a look at that too. Now, effectively what happens is, when it happens clinically, it does not look as cute as this girl on the screen. So effectively what happens is, when you tend to deliver torque or third order forces with aligners, you have a distal twist of incisors that automatically, it's pretty much like the washboard effect, and you tend to see these kind of effects, or the wagon wheel effect that you tend to see pronounced in terms of trying to deliver torque, irrespective of what modality you're using, if an adjunct is not used. So, we're not doing too well with deep bites, we're not doing too well with open bites, we're not doing too well with alignment, we're not doing too well with torque. Probably we are doing a little bit better with space closure. Well, in terms of space closure, the headache is actually real, because when you are trying to close an extraction space, essentially the focus is on the length of this particular beam, because that biology doesn't change. Now, this length of the beam will be effectively closed if you have rigidity of the beam, or if the length increases. Now, data tells us that when the length of this beam increases 4 millimeters, and that is what you're going to see in extraction cases, aligners pretty much are working like this girlfriend is working behind her boyfriend's back. So they're not really helping your cause, they're actually working against the mechanics that you set out to do. So, the point that I'm trying to make is, treating patients with aligners is pretty much a tightrope walk, unless you're doing minor crowding, minor malocclusions, and that is pretty much what data tells you. In fact, in the era of tertiary data and evidence-based dentistry and systematic reviews, when you overview all the systematic reviews that have been published, you figure out that normally you never have a forest plot that is so definitive towards or against in terms of efficacy of an appliance. But in terms of aligner efficacy, you pretty much see that it favors the control group. That is, we're still not there when it comes to fixed appliances. So why does this phenomena occur? Now, it's important to understand that effectively, the first thing that we need to look at is that your default tooth movement is always uncontrolled tipping, which we were conventionally taught is not the best way to move teeth. Forced delivery in terms of degradation is something that has been not researched or publicized often enough by material manufacturers. The moment you insert an aligner, probably in the first 20 minutes, you're losing 80% of forced delivery. And this is across most systems. In terms of stress relaxation or activation schedules, we still do not have protocols that are universal. Prediction algorithm has unknown variables, so it is an indeterminate force system of a different nature altogether, and intraoral degradation of mechanical properties always tends to occur. So what exactly is missing in the aligner material? Effectively, when the rest of orthodontics follows a variable unus of elasticity concept, you are dealing with a material that is constantly offering the kind of force levels that you would expect lower than an M90 arch wire. And in terms of stress strain curves, you are seeing a phenomena that causes a very, very fast leakage. So your resistance to deformation is very low and resilience is extremely low. Now, what could be the possible solutions? The possible solutions include, if you're making tipping your primary orthodontic tooth movement, then leverage it with reciprocal movements in other parts of the jaw. Look at less activation per aligner, more aligners per patient, effectively use shape molding, and look at material thicknesses and newer aligner materials that are available. These are possible solutions. Until we figure out what is that absolutely effective cocktail, you're probably looking at a situation where your shopping bag asks for much, much more than just plastic. And that is the reality that we will have to live with. With this, we go on to the second part of my presentation, and that is my golden circle. So, now this was a terminology that I borrowed from a business coach called Simon Sinek. And whatever be the sphere of life, philosophically at the center of every concentric circle has to be a why. Why are we doing something? The moment you figure that out, the how and what tend to be much easier to do. So why are we looking at ineffectiveness of aligners, or why is the data telling us that? And you tend to see sometimes different things on clinical case reports. So when we look at my golden circle, we're going to focus on three areas. What is it that the aligner study tells us? Because I'm going to come to one of my papers that is probably quoted on every aligner platform, and most people who quote it haven't really read the manuscript thoroughly, about 50% efficacy of aligners. What are those tooth movements that effectively move teeth and which are the ones that don't? And what could be the possible solutions to fix this problem? Now, this has been discussed in a paper that was published in the JWFO, which had a group of global collaborators and some of the best minds in aligner and TAT biomechanics who were a part of this team. Now, going back to the first paper that I spoke about, this paper is the most cited orthodontic paper of this decade. In the decade from 2020 onwards, this is the most cited orthodontic paper, with more than 470 citations on Google Scholar and 270 on Scopus. So I go to any orthodontic meeting, anybody who talks about aligners tends to quote this paper and talks about the numerical value of 50%. Now, very few people who read the paper and look at the discussion section of this paper talk about one simple fact, that almost 80% of the patients that we evaluated would have actually passed the ABO-OGS exam if those cases were evaluated for an ABO-OGS score, which means the quality of clinical finish was pretty much acceptable. That is a fact that's not understood. Then why is this figure of 50% hovering around? And I will come to that in a little bit. So effectively, a paper in the JWFO by Dr. Madhur Upadhyay and Sara Arko talks about this particular chart that you're going to see in a lot of lectures. So this is the mean percentage, and different tooth movements have different percentage efficacies as reported in literature. So effectively, what we need to do is, in terms of mean percentages, work on yellows, and in terms of every other tooth movement, work on the orange bars. So the mission here is you want to reduce the orange bars because the aligner did everything that they did in the blue bars, and you expect your adjunct and attachments to do what the blue bars did, so you need to do those things with your orange bars. So if you effectively use your aligners more effectively, you will be able to reduce these orange bars. But before that, it's important to understand that why did we have such big sized orange bars, or why were the blue bars not that effective? Now, we analyzed this in a paper that we published in the Turkish Journal of Orthodontics last year. It's important to realize a few phenomena. Firstly, most studies on aligners that look at clinical efficacy, first of all, are they mimicking true clinical scenarios? Now, papers that look at patients treated in a teaching department by residents probably do not mimic a true clinical scenario. Secondly, most of them are studies on non-extraction patients. The inclusion criteria had very few adjuncts used or a standardization there. And despite that, what were we really measuring on those studies? So, we did find that anterior root torque, posterior anchorage, intrusion, extrusion, rotational control, mesiodistal movement, and buccolingual deepening definitely were work in progress as far as aligners alone are concerned. But another interesting fact, and that is extremely critical to look at, is a paper that is recently published in Seminars in Orthodontics by Nick and his group. Very often, when we are looking at the wrong finish line or the wrong goal, if you start to seek an improper goal, you're going to get information that does not make clinical sense. So, what Nick and Thomas Burzowski have done on this paper is, they have gone back to all the aligner studies and looked at the statistics that have been employed. And I was happy to actually have this published as editor-in-chief, though it looks at my own studies very critically. That's something you need to do when you are planning, especially percentage agreement, is to look at the clinical equivalence as a threshold. So this should be the decision tree when you're planning a study on superimposition. Now, what's most important is, correlation coefficients, classic bed tests, percentage formulas are probably not the best way to look at aligner efficacy. And more than a decade of aligner research tells us this, that percentage accuracy, when you look at them in studies, is not telling you anything that you can utilize effectively from a clinical standpoint. And that's extremely critical to look when we start rounding in numbers. Effectively, what are the other factors that we should look at when we're looking at discrepancies? How was the cases selected for that particular studies? What were the different modulus of elasticities of the aligners used? And was a change regimen ever prescribed in treatment, or was it a one standard size that fits all? Also, when you're looking at non-extraction cases, in terms of case selections, it's important to understand what was the default primary orthodontic tooth movement. Because if you are expanding and carrying out IPR for almost as your primary method of gaining space, and then you're evaluating those cases, does that mimic good orthodontic practice in the first place? What was the amount of overcorrection that was brought about? In terms of time-sensitive aligner change regimens, was there a protocol that was used? Did attachments, altered geometries, or force application of teeth have specific protocols that were incorporated and reported in the material and method section of that study? And what were additional biomechanical considerations, and did you allow clinical adjuncts to be incorporated? Because when you compare an aligner trial that looks at clinical efficacy, and then you have an exclusion criteria saying patients where elastics were used, patients where modified attachments were used, patients where adjuncts were used were excluded from the study. That's not mimicking a real world scenario, and that's important to understand that. Now, let's have a look at some examples. So, very often, a lot of aligner practitioners whose only source of education is an aligner conference tend to look at IPR as a magic bullet. Now, we did an audit, and this is a paper you should see very soon, of common errors that you see with interproximal reduction clinically when IPR is used extensively in aligner cases. Now, you're going to get ledge formation, tissue injuries, excessive IPR, rough surfaces, and all of these are supposed to occlude and give you great clinical results. Ain't going to happen. Or a scenario like this, where you create new kinds of tooth architecture that you never started with. Or another example, when you're looking at expansion. Now, I am not a great fan of cross elastics in the posterior segment. But this was a patient which required correction of a crossbite on this particular tooth. Alright, and what did we see? Almost after 4 rounds of refinement, every other tooth moved. Okay, these are with in-house aligners, but this molar just did not budge. It only budged when we swallowed a humble pie and decided that this is not going to work unless there is an adjunct or an elastic that is going to be pushing teeth in that direction. So it's important to understand that you cannot be thinking biomechanics of a fixed appliance when you're trying to treat patients with aligners. Because there is occlusal coverage, I pretty much have much lesser untoward effects to be concerned about when I use this kind of mechanics. Or in an extraction scenario, this is my initial and my first approved plan. At the end of the 5th refinement, I still do not get where I need to. In a scenario like this, if I really need to add torque to the anterior teeth, there will be a TAD supported adjunct. That will be a necessity. To think that aligners can do this by themselves is pretty much living in a fool's paradise. Another factor. Now, very often we tend to talk about aligner efficacy. What about efficiency? And I remember having this discussion. This was during COVID. This was also the time when we were planning this trial, and I remember during COVID, it was the AOS conference that was being held online, and there was a roundtable discussion where I remember somebody coming up with, and I kept speaking about the importance of understanding or quantifying refinements. I remember one of the panelists coming up and saying, Nick, why are you so concerned about refinements? You know, we know it's like a game of golf. I hit my ball into the greens. Then I hit another shot and I hit it on the fairway and then it goes into the greens and then I finally putt it into the hole. So that's normal. I said, excellent, that's normal. But when you go into a golf course, you know what is the par score for that particular hole. You know you need 3 shots or 4 shots to be on par for that particular hole. Unfortunately, we had no such information until 2024 when we published this paper about refinement protocols used in leading orthodontist offices on clear aligners. So, this was the paper that we published in the American Journal of Orthodontics. Now, this is only part of the data. The other parts you will see published this year, later this year. It's important to understand that for just non-extraction cases, most of your patients needed 3 refinement scans. 2.8 is a figure that we got. There were patients even for non-extraction cases that needed up to 6, 7 and 8 refinement scans. Now, in terms of refinement per treatment, on an average, statistical average was 2.5. When the age increases above 30, your number of refinements tend to increase. The clinician estimates a treatment length. When the clinician estimates a treatment length for non-extraction treatment to be 18 months, you tend to be finishing treatment in 23 months. And these are your absolute top 1% elite practitioners from 4 different continents of the world. So this is as big as the data can get. 17% of patients had to transition to fixed appliances or braces. Now this is extremely critical to understand, that we are walking on thin ice when we are talking about efficiency, because you never told the patient this when you were consulting him first. At your first consultation, you never had this discussion with the patient, and this is exactly the real world scenario. So it's important that you account for these refinements when you plan treatment timelines. That is extremely critical and data-based information that we have. In terms of how often should one change one's aligners. Now it's important to again understand that a company decides that you're going to change aligners every 2 weeks. Then after some time they tell you, no, it's good to change every 1 week. And all of us start changing them every 1 week. Until this paper was published, there was no published trial that independently looked at change protocols. What we did find was that for most anterior tooth movement, there isn't much of a difference. But when it comes to posterior tooth movement distal to the canines, a 2-week change protocol or a 10-day change protocol definitely is more effective. And that is something that was very, very, very critically seen. Now, I'm sorry. Yeah. Another factor. Our group started to look at change protocols when you look at incorporating dental monitoring or any kind of a monitoring device. What we did find that effectively when you have a dynamic change protocol, so when I'm talking about dynamic change protocol, sometimes you're asking a patient to change aligners in 5 days, sometimes you're asking a patient to change aligners 10 days, sometimes in 15 days, depending on the tooth movement that's being planned. And this, across the 3 papers on dental monitoring that our group published, we did figure out was the most effective way to go. Now, why am I bringing this point up? This point comes up because when you have studies that say that aligners were changed every week or every 2 weeks based on the operator's protocol, we are not looking at optimal or efficient change protocols to give us data that can be clinically applied to our practice. In terms of overcorrection, how far do you go? Now, this is a given supposition that most people have, that when there is a rotation, I should overcorrect it with aligners. What about other tooth movements? For example, excessive distal tip like this. Now, when I'm going to design my treatment on a software, this is where I want to, in an ideal scenario, end. This is where I want to end. But when I'm going to carry out my treatment planning, I am going to overcorrect, probably tip it in the opposite direction so that I effectively get what I want to do. Now, in terms of overcorrection, the protocol that we tend to use is bite opening first. So BOF, bite opening always first, transverse later. Unless you open your bite, to try and do transverse overcorrection is kind of difficult. Another factor that we need to look at is age of the patient. Now, in terms of deep bite correction, we looked at a comparative study that we published last year in the Angle Orthodontist. When you're looking at mandibular intrusion, it's important to understand that in adolescent patients, you don't really need overcorrection because there was almost a 30 percentage point accuracy. A 30 percentage point accuracy increase in adolescent patients in terms of tooth movement accuracy when you're intruding mandibular incisors. But in terms of adult patients, the efficacy becomes absolutely lower. In terms of attachments or altered geometries, now this is an extraction scenario, and this was a default attachment pattern that I tended to use earlier, and you can see my molar is absolutely dancing like a classical Indian dance pose. What do we do differently today? We create a vertical attachment on the mesial surface that acts like a tip back bend. Something that we have further improvised on today is to have a slash or a 45-degree angle attachment on the molar so that it acts like a tip back bend. So we're getting much better molar control when we tend to use extraction mechanics. And we have learned the watermelon seed effect the very, very hard way. This is 2015, a resident case in Dubai. The patient was an Emirates pilot who came to close just a couple of millimeters of space distal to the canine. Slam dunk, 6 months case, you should be done, right? What happens? 2016, we've closed the space effectively, but we've created another problem that we didn't need to, because the attachment broke. And this patient kept coming during lunch hours where there was no faculty overseeing the case. The student thought that he had done something wrong, so he didn't want to discuss this with any faculty. Ultimately, one day the lunchtime probably was shorter and one faculty tended to pounce on it, saw it, we changed the attachment geometry, and effectively what should have been 6 to 8 months treatment took us almost 2 years to complete. So it's very important to understand this phenomena of attachment geometry very, very critically. Or pure root movement. To create an implant space, again the attachment protocol that's been used here is a slash attachment or a sash attachment that is used very, very close or as cervically as possible, which increases the amount of space that you can get. You can give it any kind of name. There was a yin-yang attachment that has been spoken about in aligner circles. Can I give you a very honest feedback on it? Whenever I've tried to use it, I have had no success with this kind of an attachment. If you're going to actually mesialize or distalize or upright a molar, you're better off using a segmental fixed appliance. These kind of attachments on a molar, if you reduce the surface area, it doesn't really tend to help. in terms of surface geometry and the algorithm cocktail. So now let's have a look at one particular scenario. This is a rotated canine extraction case, all right? Absolutely rotated canine. This is where we started post-extraction. And this is where we are. I want you to believe that I am a magical orthodont. Teeth respond to my hands. I have a secret magical bond that I put on my teeth, and the moment I do that, plastic speaks to my teeth like an love affair, and they start to move in unreasonable positions most effectively. That's enough of Bollywood for this morning. What I really did was this. So, this is called the practical man's orthodontics. We tried whatever we could with aligners. We realized it was time to get real. What was I thinking? That a plastic appliance with whatever attachment geometry would be able to connect that kind of rotation. Even if it did, it will probably take me 3 years or 4 years and 6 different sets of refinements. Does it make efficient sense to do it? Now, it's important to understand when a realism has to step in, and this is when you tend to incorporate tags or a fixed appliance component that you have endless possibilities. And that brings us to the last part of my lecture, and that is precious adjuncts. Now, I can go on different adjunct combinations for the entire day, but for the sake of brevity, we are going to stick to the next 10 minutes and look at a few clinical examples. So, I am essentially a classroom teacher, so I like to classify things. We will look at different utilities and then process this. Now, my first classification for an adjunct with clear aligners would be whether you're using it for a single tooth. So you can have tags, mini pins, composite extensions, power arms, keychains, buttons, divots, jigs. Please feel free to take pictures of these slides. For a group of teeth, sliders and jigs. And for the entire arch, you can have adjunct expanders, both TAD and non-TAD supported. I can also classify it as whether I am doing it before clear aligner therapy, during clear aligner therapy, or using it like a finishing adjunct like this, where I realize you need to add a little bit more distal tip, so you are placing it at the end of treatment. You can classify it based on what stage you incorporate the TAD or the adjunct. Very important, you can also classify it based on whether you use it in the aligner overlay method. That means your wires are doing their job and you still have aligner coverage over it, or partial aligner coverage. So this is my yin-yang. It doesn't sound as fancy, but it does the job. Just a partial fixed appliance with aligners that are only having anterior coverage. And this is how I would design my simulation for this. Now, I might speak to you in a couple of years and say that, forget about that classification that I gave you in 2025, because this is still an evolving area. Now, just a few clinical examples. This is a slider where you can use it for visualization, or an uprighting appliance with a partial coil spring incorporated into the aligner itself. And this is how it looks distally, this is how the occlusion. You're going to see a lot of these cases published in the American Journal of Orthodontics Clinical Companion as a comprehensive technique manuscript. Or a palatal appliance that was an afterthought placed to increase root inclinations. Or a scenario like this, where a retromolar tag has been used for molar distalization along with tags in a segmental mechanic. Now, this is rather interesting, where you see application of a distalizer. The moment you get your distalization, you start aligning your teeth. I'm going to come back to speaking about this particular attachment, because this is a different kind of aligner. This is a direct printed aligner, and we will do that in a little bit. So, I have 9 minutes, and we will spend that time. This is, when my boys tended to get a little adventurous and thought they could drive the car on their own. So, Very often you'll come to a meeting and you'll see people incorporating a tag or an elastic along with aligners. But how do you go about doing that? So what are the criteria and what are the factors that you need to consider? The first criteria is where are you going to make the connection on the tooth and the aligner? The second is how do you want your force to be distributed? And thirdly, how do you give your loading force onto the tag? There was an excellent paper published in Seminars in Orthodontics by Marcio Almeida from Brazil, and I think this is pretty much the best resource that anybody can get on understanding this particular phenomenon. So, you can attach elastics to tag as the first connection, or an elastics to an aligner attachment. You can attach an elastic chain like this, right? That's also a solution that's possible. You can attach a spring, a distalization spring or a particular tooth movement spring onto an aligner, or you can attach a distalizer like this, which could be tag supported to an aligner and run. And it's still less compliance proof. It's more compliance proof because you're not having intermaxillary elastics, and you know that is a big factor in different parts of the world. Or you can have a tag-to-tag aligner overlay, so my designer who's designing my click check or my virtual plan does not really need to understand anything. I just figure out my simulated intrusion movement and then use mechanics that are overlaying the tag. Now the questions that we need to ask are, when do I prefer a hook and when do I prefer a precision cut? So this is a hook and this is a precision cut where there is a cut in the aligner itself. The answer to this is very simple. You know, people tend to complicate this answer at aligner meetings. When you want force to be transmitted to an entire region, you're going to use a precision cut. When you want force to be transmitted to just that tooth, you're going to use a hook. It's as simple as that. Because the moment you go to an entire segment with an indeterminate force system, and this is again an excellent paper published in the Korean Journal of Orthodontics, which looks at this particular phenomenon, especially when you're trying to distalize the mandibular dentition. You look at what exactly happens with a precision cut. You're spreading forces. There are vertical effects that take place, you know, in that entire particular segment, and you're getting untoward tooth movements that you should not be expecting when you're trying to distalize the mandibular dentition. Another factor that's important to understand between a hook or elastic is A, what kind of compliant patients you have. I mean, you know, a part of my Mumbai patients, I can barely get them to wear an aligner. Now, if I expect them to put on additional elastics, it might be a challenge. But if somebody doesn't live in the same city, because when I have an elastic on a patient, they have to come back to the office every 3 or 4 weeks. And that's not something that every aligner patient wants. So it's important to understand this. But if I want, you know, a heroic mechanic like this, there is no way I can get this with an elastic chain. So obviously, this kind of a patient will go for an elastic. Or what is the force level? You're approximately looking at 150 grams, though I have rarely used the Dontrix scale to measure it. I know the force levels of my elastics. Now, a few modifications of buttons you can place on teeth. So you can effectively, this is the cheapest possible button. I think most people would know how to create this with just a separating spring and add flowable composite. Now, why is this important? Because sometimes you do not get contoured clear buttons for anterior teeth. Or power arms like this, especially in extraction cases. Now, this is one of my colleagues from India, Dr. Digant Thakkar, who is a 3D printing geek. So this was a problem we were grappling with. We did not have contoured buttons in the anterior segment, so he 3D printed them. You know, these are about 70 buttons for $1, so it was as simple as that, polycarbonate buttons. Or with direct printed aligners, you can actually create a bootstrap within the aligner itself. So you can create a hook like this in the aligner material itself. So friends, I'd like to sum up my lecture. We spoke about 3 things today. We asked, are aligners really fantastic? Well, shape molding, which is how aligners primarily move teeth, is not fantastic by itself. By itself, it's not really good enough. In terms of the golden circle, we understood that you just can't go about incorporating an adjunct until you have specific data that tells you where you need it and where you don't. And in terms of expanding envelope, the clinical applications of integrating different kinds of appliances has only just begun. There is a lot more that will be coming up and a lot more that you will see in the years to come. And when I stand on a podium and speak, I am not really speaking for myself. I am extremely lucky and humbled to have worked with some amazing people. So this is actually the result of a lot of their efforts. I am only the mouthpiece, and I would like to thank everybody that I have collaborated with in terms of aligners during all the research that we have carried out. Thank you very much, and I leave you with one simple lesson. And that truth is to be found in simplicity and not in trying to multiply and confuse things. Thank you so much.